All right, team. In this lecture, I'm going to be covering the various agricultural regions and practices that we can divide the world up into. We're going to start by looking at a couple examples of the different climate regions that the world's classified into, talk about some other ways that regions are classified as either subsistence or commercial agricultural regions, and then get into some specific examples of a couple of each type. We won't cover every type that's included in your textbook. I encourage you to go back and spend time on that chapter, but I'm going to touch on the big ones that are included in the course description. So most forms of agriculture, all forms of agriculture really, require a particular climate in order for yields to be maximized and kind of ideal. And based on the arrangement of the landscape, where mountains are, where rivers and valleys are, and things like that, your proximity to the coast, um, your latitude and longitude, a number of factors, the world can be chopped up into these various climate regions, as you see on the map here. And the connection between climate regions and agriculture regions is very strong. And I encourage you to take time to examine this map and the next map I'm going to show you. Both of them are in your textbook. And try to make some of those connections yourself. One that I'm going to point out for you right now is if you pay attention to the B areas, the dry climates, all the orange and kind of yellow gold areas, I guess more gold, that say semi-arid or arid, take a moment to look at those areas on this map and try to lock them in your head. You'll see a lot of Central Asia, the Middle East, North Africa, the American West, South Africa, or Southern Africa rather, Australia. Pay attention to those places as we look at the next map to make an example of a connection between climate and agricultural region. This is Whittlesey's agricultural regions map, named for Durrant Whittlesey, a geographer from the 1930s who helped design this by comparing climate and growing regions. If you think about where you saw those dry and or arid and semi-arid regions on the previous map, you will see that for the most part on this map, they are all now either the blue color for pastoral nomadism or a kind of, not sure what that color is, kind of a beige, light brown, gold brown, but the one that says livestock ranching, right? Similar forms of agriculture. Both of them are raising animals for food. One is doing it commercially, one is doing it for subsistence, just to feed the farmer's family. But that's one real strong connection that you can make between climate and agricultural region, right? By comparing the arid and semi-arid regions from the previous slide to the areas that are focused on pastoral nomadism, livestock ranching, the raising of animals through grazing in pastures. As I said, both of those maps are in your textbook. I encourage you to take some time to study each of them and say what other connections you can make and add those to your notes and memory. I won't try to make every single one for you here. While climate is mostly what we're going to be focusing on throughout this lecture, there are other considerations that help define these agricultural regions. All right. One of those considerations that is going to help the definitions of a lot of these we're going to look at today is whether or not the produce of that land, the actual agricultural product, right? Whatever kind of food or animal product that might be, whether that is consumed on or off that land, right? Whether it is going to support that farming family or to support other families, right? Sold in a market to other consumers. So if it is consumed on site, right? If the food that is grown on that farm is mostly consumed by the farmer's family, we refer to that as subsistence agriculture, right? A family is subsisting off of that produce, right? That is how they get their survival, and that is the main purpose of that food. All right. This is one of your vocab words. Subsistence agriculture refers to any of several agricultural economies in which crops are grown or livestock are raised nearly exclusively for local or family consumption. This way of life is disappearing sort of more and more, and I'll try to note that later in the lecture. Even subsistence farmers nowadays grow some portion of their crops very often that they plan to sell in a market. When the majority of the food that farmers are growing is for use off-site, when it's mostly grown to be sold in a marketplace, that is commercial agriculture, right? Where the focus is commerce, is business. Again, one of your vocab words, commercial agriculture, a term used to describe large-scale farming and ranching operations that employ vast land bases, large mechanized equipment, factory-type labor forces, and the latest technology to produce enormous surpluses of food that can be sold in a marketplace. All right, we'll use these terms a lot throughout the lecture: subsistence and commercial. Climate, we've discussed already. The physical environment. By this, I mean, sort of highlands or lowlands, forested areas or plains. The idea being that the growing considerations for a humid climate might be different based on the physical environment, right? Is that humid climate a tropical rainforest, or is it sort of lowland marshes or something like that? Is it a relatively high altitude area or a low altitude area? The physical environment is going to be a big factor along with climate in what you're going to grow and when you're going to grow it. And then another consideration would be culture, that not every group around the world has the same food preferences, right? That there's going to be religious taboos or cultural preferences that preclude certain types of food from an area, like pork in Muslim areas of the world, or high levels of beef consumption in Hindu parts of the world. But then there's also going to be cultural preferences, like eating rice in East Asia, over, corn consumption or something like that. And then the last one I'd have on here that's going to come up just for a couple of the kinds of agriculture we talk about, but is also a big factor of consideration for any commercial farmer, is market proximity. All right. The distance of your producing region from the marketplace. For some forms of agriculture, that takes precedence even over the climate, the physical environment, or anything like that, right? Is if the product you are producing is very perishable, for example, it's going to be very important for you to be close to the market so that you can actually reap a profit off the stuff you sell before it gets damaged. And we'll look at some examples of that. But more ways to describe an agricultural region besides strictly climate, and a number of these factors are combined to help create maps like Whittlesey's agricultural regions map. So to briefly review some of the differences between subsistence and commercial agriculture. Remember that one is, as we covered on the previous side, right? The purpose of the farming itself. If it is a subsistence farmer, the purpose is to be consumed by the farmer and their family, right? If it is a commercial enterprise, the purpose of agriculture is for sale in a market, is for commerce, is for business. Other differences might include farm size, right? Subsistence farms tend to be small enough that one family potentially could work that land. Commercial enterprises, on the other hand, tend to be large and are ever growing. We're going to look at that in another lecture, sort of modern commercial farms and their enormous size, right? And that they're not generally the sort of family farms we have in our head. The percent of farmers sort of employed in agriculture might help us distinguish between subsistence and commercial regions. In subsistence areas, you're going to find a much higher proportion of the population engaged in agriculture, maybe even a majority of the population, 60, 70, 80%. This is due to generally some of the other things we're going to look at here, a lack of machinery, right? And a lack of maybe even adequate size of other sectors of your economy. There's not enough industrial jobs or service jobs for these people to transition into, right? So the bulk of your economy might be based still around agriculture. In a commercial area, the number of farmers is going to comprise a minority of the population, right? 2 to 5% in a lot of MDCs around the world. Think about the United States or Europe from your textbook. Um, that being said, even though there's a very small percentage of the population farming, because they're assisted so much by machinery, they're able to get probably a lot more work done. I mean, provably, than a high percentage of farmers in subsistence farming areas. All right. So the amount of your population engaged in agriculture can help distinguish between subsistence and commercial. Machinery, I sort of mentioned already there, right? In a subsistence setting, the work is mostly done by muscle power, right? Your own muscles or maybe animals helping you, but generally tools and instruments that you are wielding by hand or that some animal is, a plow or something like that, makes the work a lot harder and makes it harder to get a lot done, right? This is going to restrict your farm size and the overall amount of food you're going to be able to produce and your ability to have any surplus to sell to a market, right? So it kind of keeps you confined in a sense to subsistence agriculture. Commercial agriculture, on the other hand, is going to make extensive use of machinery, whether that's irrigation systems or tractors or kind of reaping, harvesting machines, seed drills, and other things like that, or other kinds of technology like pesticides and herbicides, all the innovations that we discussed of the Green Revolution in previous lectures. And then the last consideration, again, that we're really going to talk about more in one of our final lectures is the relationship of the farm to other industries. All right. In subsistence agriculture, there's very little connection between farmers and other industries, meat packing industries, transportation industries, agricultural research facilities, right? Those are not heavily involved in the subsistence farmer's life. In commercial agriculture, giant, agricultural researchers like Monsanto or things like that, transportation companies looking to help you transport the many tons of rice or grain from your farm to a market, all those other industries might be heavily involved and highly integrated into commercial agriculture. And a couple visuals to help you visualize some of that stuff we're just talking about there. Okay, finding data on farm size is actually kind of difficult as there's a lot of different farm types, right? Ranches or gardens. What exactly do you count as farm size, right? This is a garden you have in your backyard count. So that makes kind of meaningful comparisons between areas difficult. In general, um, graphs like this help us to see that in the more developed parts of the world, farms tend to be larger. And a big factor in that is the availability of machinery and technology to assist farmers in their work. Another consideration we were looking at was the amount of labor force, right? The amount of your population involved in agriculture. And if you take a minute to examine this map, which is also from your textbook, you can see that, as I said, I mean, in LDCs, in places without a lot of the machinery and assistance or government subsidies or things that might help farmers, you're going to look at the majority of your population engaged in the primary sector of agriculture. 50% or more throughout sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia. And then if you look at Europe and North America, relatively small amounts, right? Less than 5%, less than maybe 10%, depending on where you're at. Again, you can relate that right back to machinery. Machinery, you can see again, like compare this map and the previous map, and they are sort of mirror images of each other. Okay, the more machinery you have, generally, the fewer, the less of your population is going to be involved in agriculture, because those machines are going to be making up for that loss in muscle power. The areas that have the least amount of farmland per tractor, for example, on this slide, are going to be the places on the previous slide where we saw the most amount of population involved in agriculture. So the other things that I guess might maybe go into thinking about machinery is the availability of infrastructure, transportation systems, right? The trains and highways that are going to help you move food around the country. Because again, that's going to determine whether all the stuff that you grew on your farm is going to rot in a field or in a silo somewhere, or if you're actually going to be able to transport it to market and turn a profit. So not simply, tractors or things like that. I want you to also think that machinery might include these other avenues of technology we've discussed. Okay, now to try to get into some specific examples of extensive and intensive subsistence agriculture, I'm going to talk about these forms of agriculture you see here on the side: pastoral nomadism, shifting cultivation, wet rice farming, and non-wet rice farming. We'll build those up a little bit in the later slides. So if you remember from the previous lecture, extensive agriculture refers to the forms of agriculture that use large areas of land with relatively low inputs of labor per acre. All right. The kinds of extensive subsistence agriculture we're going to be talking about is agriculture that is both extensive, right? Makes extensive use of the landscape. Like you can see this pastoral nomad sort of grazing her sheep, it looks like, in this giant pasture, right? Extensive use of the landscape, but relatively low inputs of labor, right? She's riding the horse around, she's herding the animals, she's not having to plow anything or dig or whatever. A lot of land, but the input of labor is relatively low. Those are the forms of agriculture we're going to be looking at, where in addition to simply using lots of land, that land is going to feed relatively few people, right? It's subsistence agriculture. It's feeding the farmer and their family for the most part. The vocab word I've given you for pastoral nomadism, pastoral like a pasture, nomad like somebody that moves around, right, is a form of subsistence agriculture based on herding domesticated animals that are solely dependent on natural forage, right? They're eating the natural landscape, right? They're grazing in open fields. They're not being fed in a feedlot or on a farm, grown alfalfa or things like that. Generally, like I showed you as an example for the connections between climate and agricultural regions, dry or arid climates are favored for pastoral nomadism or livestock ranching, not because animals wouldn't do well outside of dry climates, but because other forms of agriculture do so much better outside of dry climates, right? And animals can survive in these areas, eating the grass and shrub and stuff like that. And so these areas are favored, right? It's a way to kind of maximize your land use and take advantage of these areas where normally it wouldn't be very hospitable to human life, but these animals can do well out there. So parts of North Africa, the Middle East, North and West China, Central Asia, Australia, the Western United States. We looked at all those examples on the climate map. Another kind of climate consideration or practice is known as transhumance. And this is actually a vocab word we've had a couple times this year. Transhumance is the practice of migrating your animals, your flock, between highland and lowland areas depending on the seasons, right? When there is snow in the mountains, in the wintertime, for example, these pastoralists are going to move their flocks down into the valleys, into the lowlands where it's not snowed in, right? And where there might still be grass for those animals to get to. When the seasons are flipped and there's not snow on the mountains or in the hills or in the highlands, pastoral nomads will migrate their flocks up into those highlands, give the valleys time to rest and that grass to regrow, and graze their flocks on the fields in the highlands that have, recovered over the spring. That's transhumance. A lot of pastoral nomads, and if you recall from the video I asked you to watch in the previous lecture, there's a National Geographic video in there about pastoral nomads, and attached to this lecture on the next slide, there's a short kind of fun video about the life of pastoral nomads. They're not strictly eating these animals, right? The animals provide them with a way of life. They harvest from these animals lots of dairy, for example, right? All kinds of like milk product that they're going to be able to turn into cheese or yogurt or drink as just the raw milk, as well as different hair and fur that they can use for clothing or maybe even sell to a market in excess, and then all kinds of other animal products like meat or blood or things that we might think of like that. But that would generally be sort of a last resort after you had extracted a lot of value out of that animal already, right? Once you kill it, you can't get any more fur off of it or any more milk out of it or something like that. And then even this way of life, I mean, relatively kind of low intensity form of agriculture has effects on the landscape, such as the effects from overgrazing, right? Desertification, that as grasses are kind of stripped from the soil and animals are constantly plotting and killing vegetation in an area as they walk around it, it eventually has a permanent effect on the landscape and can turn areas that were already arid and semi-arid into deserts, where as farmers return to those areas in later years, they find less and less grass or shrub growing in the area. Which you can see on this map here. Again, if you think of those climate regions that I pointed out to you at the beginning of the lecture, the arid and semi-arid areas where you find a lot of livestock ranching or pastoral nomadism, this map shows areas that are most threatened by desertification. And you see it's those same areas because they're already close to being deserts, right? They're already semi-arid or arid. The additional sort of damaging effect of increasing use by herders or pastoral nomads erodes the landscape, right, and increases the likelihood of losing that land to desert. This is that video. I don't think I can really watch it on here as I record the lecture with you unless I'm just going to shut up for 10 minutes and play it. As I upload the lecture to Google Classroom, please go on there and take a minute to watch the video if you get a chance to, and follow along in the lecture here. It's entertaining and worth watching, and gives you a good look at the life of a modern nomad, people that still live this way. Shifting cultivation is another form of extensive subsistence agriculture. Sometimes it's referred to as swidden farming or slash and burn farming. Slash and burn is a good one because it kind of tells you exactly what these people are doing in the title right there. But depending on where you're at in the world, you will hear it referred to in a number of other ways, right? In South America, the term they use is the milpa system. In sub-Saharan Africa, the shitemene, I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce some of these. And in Southeast Asia, the ladang system. All of these places are going to be humid, low-latitude climates, generally and preferably places like rainforests and things like that, where there's a lot of vegetation that's easy to get to, and maybe even preferably low population densities. If you think about slash and burn as the term we're going to use for this, that describes the process that farmers undergo in this form of agriculture. Sorry, my dog wants out of the room here. 1 second. Sorry, but that describes the process that farmers using this kind of agriculture go through to prepare the land. Basically, what happens is farmers will enter an area of fresh vegetation. They will slash that vegetation down, the bushes, the trees, the vines, and shrubs, in a small sort of garden plot sized area. They will wait for that stuff to dry, like you see here, and then burn it. Okay, this clears the land, and the ashes of that burn act as a kind of natural fertilizer, right? Help put some of those nutrients and carbon and such back into the soil. And then the seeds are planted directly in that cleared land and in those ashes, right? A lot of farmers are growing things like maize or rice, millet, manioc, yams. But the important thing to just keep in mind here is, regardless of what they're growing, it's typically not monoculture, right? They are growing a garden, a variety of different plants in this area, okay? Not sort of one thing for the most part. What is becoming more common, as I mentioned before, is an additional area for growing cash crops, particularly coffee, that can be used to be sold in the marketplace, right? Not for personal consumption. So the rest of the food grown through this method is generally for the farmer and their family to eat. When they're growing cash crops, that's to help supplement their income with a little bit of produce like coffee being sold in a market. So to help us understand some of the potential benefits and the more typically the drawbacks of this form of agriculture, let's take a minute to sort of examine this diagram here. Okay, starting with the big well-developed tree on the top there, it says primary or secondary forest. This would be the sort of untouched, ideally untouched land that swidden farmers or slash and burn farmers or shifting cultivators would enter into. They would cut that stuff down, leave it to dry for a little bit, and then burn it. Okay, then they plant their crops and do their annual crop harvest, right? The first 1 or 2 yields that they get from that area are going to be very high generally, as there's lots of nutrients in the soil and it's fresh. The more they farm on that area, because they're not putting in any new fertilizers or anything like that, and because of a process known as leaching, where rainwater or groundwater literally just sort of washes away the top layers of soil and the nutrients with it, which if you're doing this in a rainforest, there's going to be a lot of rain, and that's going to be very common. As that happens, you get about 1 or 2 planting seasons out of this form of agriculture, and then your yields start to decrease. Okay, so the idea is you would leave it fallow. You would not grow there after a couple years, and you would leave that land to regrow into a secondary forest, a process that might take 10, 15, maybe 20 years, right? So that it looks like how it looked when you first went there, and then you could come back. Now, if you have very low population densities throughout a very big land area like the Amazon rainforest or something, this could be a real sustainable form of agriculture and might even help the forest in a way, right? Might clear away dry brush and things like that, so that giant forest fires or things that we see sometimes don't break out, right? It might sort of help the kind of regular growth and natural maintenance of that forest with a little outside assistance. The problem is there's not a lot of low population densities anymore, and that there's more and more people living in those areas still practicing this form of agriculture. Even if it's a small number worldwide, in those land areas it's increased. And so what typically happens is the process begins the same. Farmers will enter into a primary or secondary forest that's untouched. They'll cut and burn everything. They'll plant their harvest for a couple years. They'll leave it fallow, right? But then instead of giving it 10, 15, 20 years to regrow into larger, more mature forests, they are returning to another field that they had farmed maybe only 5 years ago or 3 years ago, right? That has got stuff growing on it, but it's not trees, right? It's bushes and grass and things, and they're going to get less and less productive yields every time they go back to that land, till eventually the area might become desertified, right? All the good soil might have washed away, and you're left with really sort of crummy soil that can't grow much or hold on to water or anything. That makes this form of agriculture ever more destructive to the environment, kind of, and a concern in the modern day. So, to recap there, shifting cultivation or swidden farming, slash and burn agriculture only is practiced by about 3% of the world's population, which for the whole world is still millions of people we're talking about. But it is a form of agriculture that uses one of the largest percentage of the world's land. About a seventh of the world's land is used for shifting cultivation. And it's all generally in valuable areas, places like rainforests. And so there's a lot of criticisms for this, that it upsets the ecology by destroying sort of these natural resources, right? The landscapes of the Amazon, but also turning them into desert. That the root systems that hold those nutrients and soils in place are lost when those plants are killed, and that the heavy rainfall of those areas washes away all the good soil, and you never get rainforest like conditions on that plot of land again, right? This is a big problem. Although, if these guys are the major causers of that problem is another question, right? Some people would argue livestock ranching does a lot more damage to forests than a couple million, shifting cultivators do. The other criticisms would be just from kind of a commercial efficiency perspective, right? That you're using a lot of land and producing relatively small amounts of food, and that there might be other forms of agriculture that would be ideal under different conditions. That process of environmental destruction, as more and more farmers enter into an area and need to do more and more work, right, and farm with greater and greater intensity in order to feed the growing population, that is what Esther Boserup devoted some of her studies to. Okay, we have discussed the Boserup hypothesis or the Boserup thesis in previous chapters when we talked about population growth and Thomas Malthus and the worry that population would outgrow food supply. If you remember, Esther Boserup was the kind of multidisciplinary approach. That her idea was that population growth sort of would independently force people to convert from extensive to intensive subsistence agriculture, like you see in areas that practice swidden farming, right? They have to work the land more and more intensively in order to maintain the growing population of the area, till eventually they will have to abandon that form of agriculture, right? And adopt something different for that landscape. That's sort of Esther's idea in the Boserup hypothesis, that as populations grow in an area, there will be a natural shift from extensive to intensive agriculture, because people will need to do new things. They'll need to innovate and use more labor and technology in order to get the same or more yields from the land they were using. All right. And so remember, this is Esther Boserup. Her idea, she is arguing against Thomas Malthus's idea that people would outgrow food supply. She's saying, no, that'll put more pressure on people to put greater inputs of their labor, greater inputs of their technology or population into food production. Okay, intensive subsistence agriculture can be defined with the vocab definition I've given you here, right? A form of subsistence agriculture in which farmers must expend a relatively large amount of effort to produce the maximum feasible yield from a parcel of land. Rice is an important example. You can find intensive subsistence agriculture being practiced in a lot of regions of the world. In terms of population, we're going to find a lot of the concentration in South Asia and East Asia, right? Maybe close to half of the world practicing some form of intensive subsistence agriculture. All right, I've seen 45, close to 50% of the world's people, right, leading this lifestyle. again, sort of outside of climate, one of the places, one of the conditions that's going to be common where this is being practiced is densely populated areas, like Boserup was talking about, right? That as populations grow in an area, it will not be possible to use extensive forms of agriculture because the land won't be available. So there will be greater and greater pressures on the farmers of those areas to use more and more intensive methods to get the same amount of food out of their small plots of land, right? That's the other big point here, right? Intensive subsistence agriculture is generally making extensive use of small plots of land with virtually no land wasted if possible. And so you'll get some very unusually shaped farms sometimes, and I'll try to give you some examples or point that out in some of the pictures we'll look at later. The other part of this is, as it's subsistence agriculture, regardless of what crops are being grown or what the climate is, there's very little to no machinery being used. And when there is machinery, it's typically muscle powered or animal powered, right? It's a horse drawn or ox drawn plow or something like that, which is definitely technology, right? I don't know if it's exactly machinery though. And then, like all forms of agriculture, right? There's no free lunch here exactly. There are problems, environmental problems with intensive subsistence agriculture, soil salinization, which we've discussed in a previous lecture, issues of just water use and irrigation management, and some of the community conflicts that can be caused by that, or even environmental problems like water runoff or overuse, drought, etc. When talking about intensive subsistence agriculture, we can break this down as two different primary focuses, okay? Places that are intensively, practicing intensive subsistence agriculture, mostly growing wet rice, like rice in wet rice paddies, or places not growing wet rice, right? Growing other crops. So intensive subsistence agriculture, think of it as rice growing areas and not rice growing areas. Okay, and let's talk about why a farmer would be growing one or the other. The primary determinant is going to be climate, really, in areas that are moist enough, typically river valleys, deltas that also have lots, high densities of people in those river valleys and deltas, are going to be where you see people growing rice. Also, this is sort of a cultural preference too. You see it a lot in East Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia. Um, and it's going to be, rice growing, which on its own is pretty intensive no matter how you're doing it or where you're doing it. A lot of the times the seedling itself, right, can't be started right in the soil of your farm. It needs to be grown separately in a kind of nursery above ground. The field needs to be plowed and prepared, maybe even flooded with water. We'll see in some of the other pictures some sawas or rice paddies. Then you transplant the seedling into that wet, muddy field, maybe reflood it, fill it again. And if conditions are right, and generally they are, if the area is moist enough and wet enough, you'll double crop, right? You'll do this whole process 2, possibly 3 times a year if conditions are really, really perfect, right? But that's the other part of what makes it intensive, right? Is that you might be putting in double cropping amounts of labor. Now, wet rice not dominant, basically the places where they aren't growing rice, that's going to be determined by climate, right? It's generally going to be places where rice won't do well because of low rain levels, right? It's going to be more arid and kind of drier. It might be the winters are too cold for that kind of use of water, right? You're going to freeze all that rice and kill it, so you grow wheat or something instead that does better. And so in the northern, kind of drier parts of China, the interior of India, away from the river valleys and things on the coast, you'll see a little bit more of this. So think of other, grain crops kind of here: wheat, barley, corn, millet, stuff like that. And again, this is intensive. There's no machinery. All the other things are the same. Um, Because you're not growing rice, you might see relatively larger land areas if this is wheat or something like that. But again, it's going to be a lot smaller than some of the commercial enterprises we'll talk about later. And you might see intensive methods like crop rotation or things like that on a farm like this that let you sort of maximize your yields throughout a planting year. Take a minute to look at some of these. These are good examples of things we've talked about. On the bottom slide there, you see a farmer planting seedlings into a flooded rice field, right? Imagine being sort of bent over like that all day long as you kind of walk through mud would be pretty back-breaking, kind of terrible labor. Some other examples of what you can think of in terms of intensity and also alterations to the landscape. You can see in the top right examples of terracing. Terracing is where the hillside has been cut into these flat sort of steps almost, right? So you can flood those areas and grow rice all the way up that hillside, right? Which otherwise it would all just wash down the hill if you tried to do it without flattening it out, right? That's a pretty dramatic alteration to the landscape there. The other thing I want you to try and see here is the shapes of some of these fields, right? You will see that some of them, depending on the level or the angle that one area was started at or another, are really oddly shaped little kind of triangle things or round shapes. But the idea is there that it doesn't have to look pretty, right? You are trying to maximize all the land you can and farm on that. And so you see just these little strips of land for farmers to walk across and things like that, um, to minimize any sort of wasted space and give yourself as much sort of productive land as you can get. And then the top left shows farmers working by hand, right? And the greatest amount of technology you might generally see on a lot of these farms, right? Muscle powered tools like in this case some sort of ox buffaloes, powered plow as this guy prepares um, their rice farm for planting. Or it looks like some kind of plank of wood. I'm not even sure if they plow the fields for paddy farming like that.